Welcome back. I'm Lenny McAllister. You're watching the Pittsburgh Cable News Channel. This is Night Talk. Get to the point. Gregg Roman, are there really any winners and losers to this? Because people would look at this and say everybody loses, and there are many people that will say there's an awful lot of winners with this deal, considering that this is something that had been in the works for quite some time. And so they would say that it can basically come out on top on this. But there are obviously some folks that don't agree with that. In your perspective, do you see clear winners, clear losers with this?
I think the clear winner without any question is Iran.
Why?
They were able to get everything without giving up anything. Now, the original requirements that were made by U.S. legislation that was passed by 400 members of the House and 98 senators called for complete Iranian, not just disarmament of their nuclear program in terms of the military dimensions, but also the civilian dimensions. The idea was that there would be an exchange of sanctions relief in order for them to be able to completely dismantle the program. That was the U.S. starting point. Now, I understand that you have to give up some things in negotiations, but what the Iranians got...
But especially as a partner to negotiations, not as the primary side of negotiations.
Here's the fundamental interest they have to understand. And we can quote the Iranian foreign minister. He said in the Majlis, the Iranian parliament, last week, the next red line was refusal to allow inspection or refusal to accept any restrictions in the defense and missile spheres, which has been fully achieved through the deal. This is even stipulated in a UN Security Council resolution in an acceptable form. Now, what he's saying there is that Iran gets to continue its military developments, it gets to continue its ballistic missile developments, and it gets to continue all the actions right now, including its 4 areas of Arab sovereignty that they've taken over in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. They get to continue all of their military programs, all of which are substantially a threat to the United States. So while you have the partners that you have in Europe and you have the partners in America that we have on the negotiating table, the real winners here are Russia, China, and Iran. But the U.S. loses either way.
Where's the point where you're splitting hairs, where you don't just negotiate the nuclear aspect of this, and now you're saying, okay, not only can you not have the nuclear aspect, but you can't have the missile development as well. You can't have this as well. And doesn't that basically reject the whole idea that you can come up with diplomacy and peace forward? I mean, there are people, and I'm sure the ambassador would say this, that didn't we have these type of situations with the Soviet Union, who had the capability of blowing us all off the face of the earth, and yet we still got to an end of the Cold War eventually?
Well, first of all, that's right. The Iranians have to know that if this deal fails, they will lose. More than anyone else, they will lose, because there will be military attacks and they will not win, they will lose. But I wanted to disagree politely with Gregg a little bit, in that I think that while it is the case that Iran perhaps is the biggest winner in this deal, it is also the case that if the economy of the region picks up, there's a little bit less mayhem, perhaps.
Are they the biggest winner because of the money, or are they the biggest winner because of what Gregg said when it comes to keeping nuclear capabilities, basically being able to have an underground fortress or facility such as at Fordo, and still being able to keep?
That's not what he was saying. He was talking about conventional weapons. With their he was saying that, and I agree with that, of course they will continue to develop conventional weapons. That's not part of this agreement at all.
But he also said that they were able to keep conventional weapons and much of the nuclear capabilities, the facilities that were in place.
Not military. Nuclear, peaceful nuclear energy, not military.
Let us not forget that Israel currently has a monopoly on nuclear weapons in the Middle East. And if this agreement works, it will retain that monopoly on nuclear weapons in the Middle East.
Which logically should mean that they should be for this deal and hoping that it's enforced to the fullest letter of the agreement.
Precisely.
But actually there's statements that come from the U.S.'s Gulf partners. For instance, the head of the Saudi Atomic Energy Agency said yesterday in a speech that he thinks that the Saudis need to have, at least within 10 years, nuclear capabilities. You have the UAE, Turkey, Egypt, who are all also pursuing nuclear programs. A successful negotiation was Libya in 2003, when Gaddafi gave up his nuclear capability in return for the uplifting of sanctions. But it wasn't just the nuclear program we negotiated on. It was compensation for the bombing of Pan Am flight that was over the Lockerbie bombing. It was for the German disco that killed U.S. servicemen. Every single international issue that Libya had with the international community was resolved. What we have here is all the sanctions on Iran for everything lifted, and only the U.S. getting a guarantee for maybe 10 years that they won't be a nuclear threshold
But aren't we
state.
looking at the reality of, number one, this is 2015. We're in the age of ISIS. We're in the age of Al-Qaeda. We're looking at things completely differently. We have upheaval in Yemen. We have upheaval throughout the region. So you can't quite negotiate the same way you did with Libya in 2003 as you are perhaps with Iran in 2015. And on top of that, you're still talking about partners such as the EU involved in this, which, like you said, Greg, they have their own interests as to why they want this deal, unlike the United States versus Libya 12 years ago.
But you see this in a relationship between the United States and Russia. We can negotiate on Iran, but then when it comes to the Ukraine, we put sanctions on Russian officials. This isn't a bimodal world. It's not that the Iran regime is bad and the U.S. is good, or that Israel maintains a nuclear monopoly and the Iranians are not allowed to have a nuclear weapons program.
And it seems to also ignore some of the influence that Iran's had in the region, including in Syria, which as we well know, when Syria toppled, it led to the rise of ISIS. So does this deal help perhaps get us back into the mix of quelling ISIS, or is this something that's just going to funnel more money into that?
Well, let's roll the clock back to the beginning of Obama's second term. John Kerry, as Secretary of State, launched 3 negotiations. One of them was the Israeli-Palestinian discussions. The second one was to try to end the civil war in Syria, and this was the third one. Now, Israeli-Palestinian talks collapsed. The Syrian civil war talks collapsed, and one reason was that we did not permit Iran to be at the table, even though Iran was one of the players in the conflict. So that's not to say that all these other scraps are going to go away because Iran is being folded back into the international community. But it should help.
It should give us an opportunity. We're going to continue this conversation. Don't you go anywhere. I'm Lenny McAllister. Let's Get to the Point panel. This is Night Talk, Get to the Point, and you're watching the Pittsburgh Cable News Channel. One of the biggest criticisms of this deal is the fact that there are some that don't like the deal, that see this as appeasement. And that's part of the reason why in the starting point I went back to Hitler and even Putin in the Ukraine. Dr. Forrest, why or why not are those valid examples of appeasement, or this not being appeasement with the Iranian deal?
Well, it's not quite valid. It's a different world, and it's a much more complex world. In the fighting in Iraq, some of the Iranian militia have fought against the same enemy, the United States. There's been some covert cooperation, coordination between Iranian forces and U.S. forces. So this deal, underlying this deal, is the hope on the American side that that Iran can be pushed a little bit more into a more cooperative mode. So it's not the same as the examples you gave. It's I think a much more Iran has already showed that given certain circumstances, it can play by international rules. And I think the deal tries to push them further in that direction.
So guys, with that being the case and with the image of appeasement being out there, and I'll go to you first, Greg, do we think that Congress is going to eventually get into the mix and finally acquiesce to what the Obama administration is looking for, especially this lame duck president working with the international community?
I think members of Congress, especially House Democrats and Senate Democrats, have to ask the question for themselves. Are they ready to allow Iran to fully unleash its regional power as an unrestricted nation? And if they are, they have to be ready for the repercussions that are associated with that. More genocide in Syria, the oppression of Christians in Iran, gays being hanged in the middle of Tehran, and increasingly hostile activity, not just towards Israel, but the U.S.'s Gulf Arab allies.
You are a diplomat, so American politics drives you nuts. It makes your job and what you study that much worse. But how much will American politics, particularly 2016 presidential politics, with many of these people in the U.S. Senate, influence what's going to end up happening with this deal as it moves through Congress?
Well, the idea of any of the 16 Republican candidates, or the whatever it is, 4 or 5 Democratic candidates messing around with this is comparable, in my mind, to my doing open heart surgery on myself. I mean, I think that John Kerry, he spent enormous amounts of time on this, including with his counterparts from the other UN Security Council members, to achieve what I think is the most reasonable agreement we could hope for. It is a first step, sure.
So let me ask this question real quick. I'm going to go around the table, starting with you, Greg. Greg, is this going to be the landmark deal that the Obama White House is remembered for when we walk away from his administration January 2017, yes or no?
No.
Do you think this is going to be something he'll be remembered for?
It will be one of the things he will be remembered for, but I think there are many other things, or one of them being affordable care.
Will this be the landmark, or will this still be Obamacare?
It will be one. It will be one.
Will this be the landmark geopolitical initiative that we remember Obama for?
Yes, on the international plane. If it's implemented as it's written, it will certainly be his landmark international claim to fame. Domestically, of course, it will be the Affordable Care Act.
What about Cuba?
That's something else to consider. This has been a very interesting and fast-paced hour with a complex issue, which is why we're going to give these gentlemen one final time to give one final point. Coming up next, one final point here on Night Talk. Get to the point.